Hello, my name is Alexander Sabine, and it's a real privilege to be able to provide this talk for the symposium of the Active Inference Symposium. And just thank you to Daniel Friedman for the opportunity and others, of course, for their hard work in ensuring a successful Active Inference Institute Symposium for 2025. So I'm introducing the Coherence Rupture Regeneration framework. I'm thinking about developing a mathematical language that helps people navigate change and uncertainty, but also to just understand temporality and how systems maintain themselves whilst changing, which has always been a philosophical mystery to me in the context of the ship of Theseus and that kind of thing. But also just in systems theory in general, why things seem to need to collapse but then repair through time as well. So I've developed a three-part formalism that I'm going to speak through today. And just to explain why those things are on the screen at the moment, on the left there's a real hurricane image from the recent hurricane in Jamaica. On the right of there, in this smaller one here, is actually a simulation that you can watch on the website cohere.org.uk, along with many other biological simulations and physical simulations. For instance, on the right there, peanut heating and energy transfer. All of the simulations I've built on the site are designed to actually run the CRR equations, which I'm going to talk through in this presentation. So they're all close approximations to it. I did use a large language model to help code those, but I have rigorously checked them to ensure that the actual equations I was running as closely to the full CRR as possible. So there's perhaps something noteworthy there just to see the full breadth of domains which I've applied the CRR to. And I should say right from the start, although I will repeat this later, that I'm not claiming that this replaces anything. This is a coarse grain temporal model to think about systems theory and how systems maintain themselves whilst changing. So I was asking a question about the sort of simple patterns that underlie how all systems change through time. My background's child development, so I've watched children grow through phases, specifically Piagetian cognitive stages as well. And I've done some mathematics around the free energy principle and CRR to think about those phase shifts or those little ontological jumps that we go through where we suddenly see the world differently. And I don't think they stop through time. I think actually, if we were to track that through the life course, we would see those repeated ontological shifts and changes in our lives through these coherence, rupture, regeneration cycles. So I was asking the question of what builds as free energy reduces. So this idea of coherence increasing as free energy reduces, i.e. successful policies or things that made sense in the past mean increased coherence as the free energy reduction minimization works more effectively. So I was interested in how those historical policies inform are reweighted into future states in both biological, physical, and psychological substrates. And today I'd like to introduce that, explore that, and open to any further discussions moving forward. I should say as well, my background is child development and higher education. I'm not by trade a mathematician, but I will be explaining the CRR I would say was sort of perhaps final undergraduate year mathematics. And it's a novel framework that I've developed to try to understand how systems maintain themselves through time. So I describe myself in a sort of pupae soup stage at the moment, just developing this framework further in a kind of cocoon. I've been working on it for about 8 months now, and the website is the product of that for people that want to explore this a bit further in a playful way, to engage with some of the questions that arise from this CRR framework. So what do I mean by coherence? Well, for me, as I mentioned earlier, coherence is the inverse of free energy reduction. And coherence builds as a kind of memory density through time. So systems accumulate patterns that work, policies which are effective, for instance, and they accumulate as we go through those action perception cycles in time. What I've noticed, however, is from a finite state machine, i.e. from within my own Markov blanket as a human being, I've noticed there are sort of critical thresholds where this coherence exceeds to a certain point, and then the exploitation kicks in, I guess, from an active inference situation where the free energy spike can no longer be reduced because new stimuli emerge from the field of reality. And this seems to create a kind of rupture that I call a rupture, where then those past states are then reweighted into future states, for instance, following trauma or after an insight or a crisis, or an ecological collapse as well, if there was a forest fire, for instance. And the mathematical framework I'm introducing seems to be able to model that temporal pattern quite well across different substrates. We'll also be talking about something called regeneration. So just to explain, there's three components: coherence, rupture, regeneration, that make up the CRR. And that third one, regeneration, is about how things repair after collapse, so how something new assembles from what came before. It's not just a blank slate starting again, nothing's ever forgotten, but it's the reorganization that's reweighted by what mattered most. So these are the three fundamental principles I'm going to be exploring. And I also note that this is, I think, scale invariant as well. So just like with the free energy principle, the CRR can be applied at any scale. Just as a provocation, it'd be interesting if you could reflect on your own life and think about perhaps times where you felt like everything makes sense and everything's just as it should be, and then suddenly some exogenous or endogenous rupture, so either from inside or outside or both, happens that then makes you have to like change your life in some way. Um, but then how those past experiences are reweighted into those future states. I've put a link on this slide as well, which I think you can access through the Active Inference Institute. Um, and that link just takes you to some biological simulations. So with this mycelium network here, that's modeled with the CRR, and you can see it as a coherence network in time and how the different hyphae relate to each other through the network. So my background, as I said, child development, but also my doctoral studies were in participatory civic mapping or participatory action mapping. So I was interested in how people define the territory and challenging top-down models of mapping. This then got me thinking about what reality is a little bit too much, and I developed a kind of framework for socially democratic mapping in the theme of sort of social justice. But underneath all of this, during my doctoral studies, I was really intrigued by neuroscience and the action perception cycle, um, specifically what happens with free energy reduction and how coherence accumulates through time. It got me thinking about the nature of reality. And actually, as you'll see as we go through this presentation, I kind of concluded that reality is a process and that we're not just sort of bodies in the world, but we are the world, or we are reality. So this got me thinking in a big way, and I will touch upon some of the philosophical and ontological findings as I navigate this presentation. So I started to call this idea of coherence memory density, sometimes mnemonic entanglement density, or accumulated meaning through time. And I started to wonder what gives rise to this experience in the first place. So what is going on in the current moment of generative modeling? So what is it that's actually the basis of reality itself? Which, as I say, took me into a sort of deep philosophical question, and the CRR was the outcome of that. So it emerged from this idea of staying with these questions phenomenologically and developing a mathematical framework to help me make sense of that. And I had, as I say, a background in developmental psychology, so noticing how children's ontological lens shifts through time as well. So why might this matter now? Well, what I've noticed from Discord chats and just the news and generally is that we seem to be living in a sort of state of I don't want to say chaos necessarily, but we've got AI proliferation, climate shifts, economic crisis, social transformation. People call it the meta crisis. And I also noticed this very powerful technology, AI or large language models, that seem to be a mystery to many in many domains, and they will, I'm sure, remain that for a long time. Um, but I noticed also a language problem that people between different paradigms weren't always able to communicate between paradigms as well as LLMs can. Large language models can triangulate across a vast corpora of that they've been trained on, or corpus that they've been trained on, and therefore they're able to make huge, wild, creative leaps between domains. As the presentation goes on, I'll describe that later as having a high omega state, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you might understand what I mean by that. So my question is, perhaps CRR offers a kind of coarse grain framework that works across different substrates to understand how different algorithms or different systems interrelate between their Markov blankets in reality. None of this is designed to replace any specialized languages or microscopic physics or paradigm learning, but it's more of a way to understand temporality between paradigms. Just by the way, this is a thunderstorm, so coherence accumulates in the clouds as charge, and then rupture thresholds are met, which then creates the lightning, and you can see the actual graph and you can see the code. I haven't hidden any code, so any coders out there interested in how I've been doing these can have a look. And also the sound from these is diegetic, meaning that it comes from within the script. It's not recorded. It's just sound that comes from it. So it's quite cool to listen to the psychoacoustic effect of the thunder and lightning in its own right. So what is the mathematical structure of the CRR? Well, here it is in plain terms, and I have made some other videos on this which are available on YouTube, and you can click the link at the top right there to watch some of those videos. And in some of those videos, I take through a bit more slowly in how I'll do it today. So hopefully I'll do just enough of the mathematics for people. As I say, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm trying to make sense of it phenomenologically and with specific axiomic starting points to reach between different paradigms, because I feel that's important. So first of all, coherence is this top one on the left. So CXT equals the integral Lx tau d tau from time 0 to time t. And coherence accumulates. So essentially what you have there is an accumulator. And I call this memory density through time. So as you might, free energy principle, think of it like policies that were more effective would have higher coherence, lower free energy. So coherence would accumulate or go up as free energy reduces. Rupture, I use a Dirac delta in various different formats. I don't want to get too much into the specifics of the mathematics of the Dirac delta, but just for phenomenological purposes for ease during the discussion today, we can think of it as a discretized perturbation in time that can be an instant moment where rupture occurs. Now, because this is scale invariant, that rupture could be for a whole ecosystem, or it could just be from the moment of right now that metabolizes my past states, that's that coherence integral, into future states. So that moment of now that sits between the two. So just as an easy way of thinking about it, coherence could be thought of as all past states, which is cumulative and also non-Markovian. So all past states matter. Dirac delta of now, which is also a rupture in an ecosystem or any system. And then that third operator there is the regeneration operator. So that's how the system seems to rebuild after rupture. So for instance, with cancer, once a therapeutic intervention is working, how that regeneration takes place over time, or with a forest fire or after trauma. Naturally, different systems have different ways of managing that and metabolizing rupture. And we're going to talk about different omega thresholds that relate to different ways that people and systems navigate those traumas and rupture moments in their lives. So just to recap, CXT is the coherence as path integral, what accumulates when the patterns work. Dirac delta is a rupture as discontinuity, the moment everything changes. And as I say, that could be moment to moment, just right now, in your everyday experience of past into present into future. But equally, it could be a more wider scale rupture where coherence is built up and needs to rupture because you've been in an exploitative policy for too long, and then free energy can no longer be reduced, and we need a new generative model to cope. Thirdly, regeneration, which is weighted by the exponential c over omega, which rebuilds from what mattered most before. So this is where the historical states here in the regeneration operator picks up from the coherence function there in that first part. So again, it's past, present, future is an easy way to think of it. And this part here is what picks up from here. But then we've got this exponential, this what I'd call like a Boltzmann-like exponential, which means that actually after trauma, if we're resilient, we can actually build back even stronger than before. So these were phenomenologically derived, and I've been playing with them, as you can see from the website, in different systems. So this is the humble offer of CRR, that it provides perhaps a temporal structure. It is time asymmetric, so we can think about the arrow of time in that way. The Heaviside function, which I didn't mention just now, helps to keep that um, nice flow of time. I want to say from left to right. That's just how I think of it, of course, but from past into future states through that direct delta. So this offers a way to think about the past, that is what accumulated, the present transition point, and also the future, which is reweighted possibilities. Obviously, we can never know the future because of that Heaviside function, and because that we act in that moment of the Dirac delta in every moment, reducing free energy. Cross-domain translation. So I see the same pattern in child development, ecosystems, organizational change, personal transformation, and also physical systems too. And on the website, that's why I've tried to show the breadth that you can apply CRR to, which seems at least noteworthy in this context. Also, if we notice as people what pattern we're in, then we might be able to more practically navigate the kind of rupture cycle. So notice if somebody's in a very high coherent phase, like everything's making sense together, and they're also what we'll come to see as high amiga, which means they're in a exploratory, anything's possible kind of way. It can often induce rupture, which is either an ontological collapse where you just go into shock with all the possibilities, and no one else understands you around you. Like for instance, AI psychosis would be a good example of that, where somebody has some profound realization, whether it's has any validity to it or not, is irrelevant. The fact is that they can't articulate themselves in the social field. They can't share the accumulated coherence with others, which causes isolation and alienation, and essentially the definition of psychosis as well. So that's interesting to me. And then finally, um, the CRR offers, as I said, to bridge between paradigms. So thinking about why it is that it seems so effective in psychological, physical, and biological systems. I should re-emphasize as well, I'm not claiming that CRR has any microscopic detail within those paradigms, but it helps us to understand how time works within and between those paradigms. So coherence. I think of coherence just for ease of convenience as a field. Um, So I know that in existing free energy principle and active inference, often we think about long-term uh, memory reaching back through Markov chains. I see myself as in a Markov blanket, but I rethink that a little bit, and I imagine myself to be in a field, in a non-Markovian field that I actually call reality itself. So the idea that memory is stored in not stored at all actually, but as a process, but the field of reality itself is that non-Markovian substrate, if you like. So for computational tractability, I as a Markovian agent have to engage in that free energy principle process through time, but equally I am both Markovian, but equally, if I was to take my Markov blanket off, I would be in a non-Markovian field of eternity, essentially, for want of a better expression. So in active inference, we've got precision-weighted prediction errors that decrease, and the model becomes more validated through time. And in development, we've got a child who might, for instance, practice walking hundreds of times, building coherence through that repetition. In organizations, it would be the successful collaborations that we create, successful prior policies that we know work together. That would be building coherence. And in your life as well, like mastering a skill, perhaps deepening a coherent field with another Markov agent, or understanding a domain. So all forms of coherence accumulation through time. Throughout the presentation, I'll refer to the coherence as memory density, which is that Lx tau here, and it's what gets validated and strengthened at each moment. Phenomenologically speaking, it's the feeling of groundedness and competence, like, yeah, I get this. Or in Csikszentmihalyi's theory in positive psychology, this idea of flow would be associated with a high coherence state. In biology, in the work of Michael Levin, I see coherence as cognitive glue. So it's that what keeps a biological system together through time. Also, just to mention in intergenerational terms, this idea of coherence accumulating through time, through generations as well, each birth being like a rupture, the creation of a child, and so on and so forth, which helps in some way to explain, through my research, it helps to explain intergenerational trauma patterns. As I say throughout the presentation, I am based on an ontological foundation of what's called process philosophy, so sort of Whitehead and also participatory reality as well, with Wheeler. So these are these are accepted philosophical positions, and it just happens to be the position that I've arrived at by researching the mathematics of free energy in the context of the CRR. So I do actually see reality as a field of memory, or field of physical memory. So that would sort of collapse together materialism and idealism in one. And I know that Friston and others have articulated similar-ish metaphysical frameworks as well. And I think it's important right now to be open and honest about that, because I sense that we're in a time of ontological shift. Many people call it the end of the Anthropocene, the beginning of a sort of AI post-human era. And so I think we do need to be prepared for AGI, or whatever that means, ASI, those sorts of things, and understanding how we might need to navigate those entanglements moving forward. So I've been brave and shared my ontological understanding, much as though I'm sure that it may not be shared by everybody. Just to say as well, so we can think about our coherence as your identity, your integral of your weighted experiences through time as a Markovian agent in a non-Markovian field. And I'm sorry if you're sat there thinking, I don't think of non-Markovianality like that, but that's just how I've sort of framed it. So as I say, finite coherence has limits. So if we are mortal engines or mortal substrates, as Friston says, engaged in that active inference cycle, then we can imagine ourselves as being embedded, and we imagine ourselves as being embedded in a sort of eternal field, in a kind of Blakean, William Blake sense. On my first degree was English literature, so if all the doors of perception were cleansed, man would see everything as it is infinite, but we've closed ourselves off, so we see only through narrow chinks in our cavern. So I think of us as finite state machines, but existing in an eternal field and operating in a computationally tractable free energy principle reduction over time. So if our policies become too rigid and too exploitative, that high coherence creates stability, but also a resistance to change as well. So for instance, a child that goes through the sensory motor phase will build coherence through that phase, but then struggle to think symbolically. So there needs to be this shift in their generative model, or a new generative model through time. So the old ways almost work too well, leading to rigidity and narrowness through that exploitation. And we therefore have to have exploration or creativity. Or an organization with strong cultural coherence may resist pivots, so be less agile, for instance, or your own expertise, your domain expertise can cause functional fixity through time and make it harder to see new possibilities. This is where in the CRR, in the regeneration operator, it's where omega matters. So omega changes how rigid or fluid the coherence is through time. So how much you can accept new ideas, which can also be dangerous as well if you accept too many new ideas, or how rigid you are, saying like, no, this is my Markov blanket. So it's almost like a measure of how thick or thin your Markov blanket is. Through my toy simulation research, I found that things like hurricanes have high omega, so much more dynamic and rapid and changing, and things like ice are much more predictable and have a low omega. So I know it's sort of crude to use an LLM to derive specific values for the omega threshold in the simulations I've been building, but it's a methodology that seems to make some sense to me at least. So this omega in the regeneration operator here is like the temperature of change. It almost sets that rupture threshold. So the exponential of C over omega determines how much accumulated coherence influences those future states. If we have a low omega, it means that past patterns strongly constrain the future possibilities. So we go into a stable or risk averse situation. It's sort of a thickening of the Markov blanket, if you like. This is me, that is that, and we are this, rather than, okay, well, maybe we'll try that. A high omega is where past patterns weakly constrain future. So we've got much more exploratory, enabling creativity, but also risking chaos as well. So they both come with their ups and downs, like anything. In active inference terms, we can think of omega as relating to the inverse precision weight. So how confident the system is in its predictions. So reference to Thomas Parr there. Different systems have different omega. So ice crystals will have very low, as I say, ecosystems medium, creative exploration high. I'm not a mathematician, so I have had to just make these toy simulations, reach out to people who are interested in the same things as I am, and explore possible collaborations. A useful phrase I've come up with, although it's not brilliant, but a lower omega risks rigidity and enables stability. Higher omega risks liquidity and enables creativity. And I'll show you a visualization of that in just a moment. So I'll show you, as I said, a particle simulation, just a playful way of expressing the relationship between the free energy principle and the CRR dynamics that I'll put on my website. As I say, low omega, on this simulation, you'll see future particles that are large, bright, and deterministic. So you're sort of resisting future change. High omega, you'll see particles that are small, faint, and dispersed, so many possibilities remain open. So we'll have a play now. So we can shift the omega value. Let's see if I can just switch my screen, or I'll just drag it over, I think. So I'll try to make sure that this is on the website. So there's a sort of particle thing. I think of Bergson's thickness of time in the center there, in that now moment. You can see on the bottom left there, if you can just about make out, I'm going to zoom in a bit. So we've got rigidity on the left, liquidity on the right, and here we've got the free energy principle precision weighting, with the low being explore and the high being exploit. So we're going to see as we shift omega, we can see they're inversely proportional. So a high omega in CRR, coherence, rupture, regeneration, means high creativity. I'll just put some prediction error one on there. Let's increase the time flow a bit. Some more particles. Okay, so we can see high liquidity means, or high creativity, or high omega means, in free energy terms, low ability to explore. If I shift that the other way, almost too far, we can see now we've got past states much more sort of firmly influencing future states, so we're not able to think in more diverse kind of ways. So we can just play with the slider there, play with time flow rate and all sorts. And again, you can see there the past, present, future. It was really hard, by the way, to think about how to graphically represent time. If you've ever tried it before, it's difficult. I know that Michael Levin's cognitive light cone does a great job on that. So yeah, you can mess around with that and just explore that idea of changing omega. Also, just I put some speech bubbles on, so creativity flows through my uncertainty, and then go low. I know exactly how things should be. The world must comply. So it's a playful way to explore omega. And as I talk through the rest of the presentation, hopefully, he says it will make more sense. Okay, let's go back to where I was. So the direct delta of now, if you like, or the rupture, means, yeah, it could be the moment of now and how we integrate from or metabolize past states into future states, but equally it can show how the system's accumulated coherence until something breaks. This isn't failure, I'd argue, but transformation, and I think it's almost a thermodynamic necessity that things have to go through this cycle, this CRR-like cycle. In development, it's the moment of insight, for instance, when you think, I can't do this with my current understanding, so you need a whole new kind of generative model. That's what I call rupture, or the introduction of M2 in terms of the free energy principle and active inference. In an organization, you can think about it as a strategic pivot point where you need a restructuring, where the kind of standard model has crystallized too much through time, become too functionally fixed, and can't adapt quickly enough. So I think many organizations are facing this. And perhaps it's helpful for organizations to think about their omega threshold here too. In personal life, it could be a breakup, career change, paradigm shift, even an awakening, sort of, some sort of sudden enlightenment kind of moment where everything changes and you can never not see it. You can't go back to how things were, and that's the moment where your past states are reintegrated into future states, from the position of your own individual self. We can get into all sorts of metaphysical rabbit holes here because you start to wonder, if reality is a field of physical memory and process philosophers were right, then you start to wonder whether, in 10 years after a rupture, after a trauma, suddenly everything made sense again, why that had to happen. You start to sort of think, okay, well, you're in some sort of intergenerational field here, metabolizing. So the direct delta can be a discontinuity. It's that moment that everything changes, but equally it's that moment of every moment's different, no moment's the same. So it can be a single moment in time or a single moment of rupture in the larger spatial temporal system. It's scale invariant is what I'm trying to say. So it's temporally and spatially scale invariant. Ruptures often happen just when coherence is highest. I don't know whether you've ever felt this, that sometimes everything makes sense and then suddenly some sort of horrible thing happens, or you internally just can't cope anymore and you make a big decision to change everything. So it's almost like this thermodynamic necessity that coherence can only reach a certain threshold after which there's rupture and renewal. In my other videos as well, you'll note that even a day and night sleep cycle can be thought of as coherence building through the day, rupture as a dream where you metabolize the states, past states, into future states as well. Regeneration operator can be thought of as the dream, processing those past states. So ruptures aren't purely random, although stochasticity is yet to be explored in this. Ruptures occur when coherence reaches critical threshold, or C crit, and it's modulated by that omega threshold. So that's why therapeutic practices need to think about, I think, the omega threshold with people and provide those therapeutic environments to enable rupture, enable people to go into a sort of higher temperature mode where they can explore more and future possibilities and so on. So in child development, I mapped this to Piagetian cognitive stages and found that the sensory motor phase mathematically works out exactly right if you use the CRR equations to the moment when the child reaches 2, for instance, at the end of sensory motor phase. Those past states of being in the sensory motor ontology are not lost, but they're reweighted into the concrete operational ontology, and so on. I did this also with Erickson as well. With Erickson's psychosocial stages, so just to explain, Erickson has stages of conflict through life that you can get through, but you have to usually return to it psychoanalytically, if you don't navigate a stage well enough. So with Piaget, mathematically, you have to go through those stages because they're hierarchical. So you need to go through each one because your ontology can't cope if it doesn't do that. Whereas with Erickson, it's orthogonal, so you can navigate through those stages going through either one. You might fail at a stage and then revisit it later on in life, like a midlife crisis or something like that. Interestingly, I find it curious that the same mathematics I use to make mycelium or black hole or a sun or just anything really seems to be the same mathematics that's driving child development processes as well. As I said at the beginning, I'm not claiming that this replaces any of that, but it might help to explain mathematically what these child development theorists were seeing. In an ecosystem, and I know that we need to think about regeneration in ecosystems more than ever right now, resilience holds up until a tipping point, and then we have rapid reorganization. What the CRR suggests is thankfully what many ecologists are doing already, such as in soil science, where you need to keep crop rotations going. That's rupture. So essentially, you're working a proper rupture cycle rather than building monotonic coherence through time that would lead to a catastrophic rupture. So I think perhaps the CRR can help us to manage our ecosystems better. And also, as you'll see from the website, you can use the CRR on physical and biological data as well. So perhaps in your own experience, you've had a time where you think to yourself, well, I just can't keep doing this. And that crystallizes into a single decision. Like perhaps it's that you're having a baby or that you're going to leave someone, could be either or, doesn't have to be good or bad. Although rupture sounds bad, it doesn't have to be bad. Just a moment in time where you made a decision that changed everything. And then all those past states are then reweighted into future states through that ontological shift. I found with CRR, my argument or conjecture is that this timing isn't random, but it's thermodynamic and related to how much coherence is accumulated, and also that omega value as well. Um, Interestingly, other connotations that arise from this are that I think it might come to become apparent with continuous learning or continual learning and catastrophic forgetting systems that you can't stop forgetting. So you have to manage forgetting. And I think I've read some papers around this. There were things published in Nature saying that they've realized that sleep helps AI. And I think even ASI would have thermodynamic limitations on it and require some sort of CRR-like cycle. So that might help if you're working in machine learning catastrophic forgetting to focus attention on how you actually regulate forgetting rather than trying to stretch out learning, because I don't think you can. It's a little bit like saying to a human, stay awake for 7 days. They'd go mad, and I think we have to be really careful about AI that's that's psychotic. Okay, so just pushing the boundaries a little bit more. In the CRR, the absolute present isn't necessarily when you're in the absolute present, it's not a duration, it's a singularity. So that would be the right at the top of that direct delta. So the direct delta is mathematically at the top right here. So it's infinite in the center and zero everywhere else. So we can think about it as a rupture point between what was and what might be, and that right at the top of that direct delta would be like one of my favorite people, Ram Dass, who was Richard Alpert, a child development professor, who then became a Buddhist guru, and he was, brilliant, lovely, beautiful man. And I would describe him as sort of right at the top of that direct delta, and he was doing his breath work and Buddhism and so on. He, broke through, so to speak. I would describe that as the dissolution of the Markovian boundary, and he was in that state of absolute now, because that's to me the absolute direct delta. However, we're usually in a discretized version of that within our brain, within those various different processes that give rise to duration or dure in a Bergson sense. So, just as a complete conjecture, perhaps the awakening is the peak of this rupture where the Markov blanket dissolves. I'd like to just highlight that CRR seems to have therapeutic applications, and what I'm noticing in the world with AI and increased people, I've noticed some forums where people are taking certain substances and using AI, and AGI is going to get even more powerful. I wonder whether we need to start thinking really carefully, following work by people like Robin Carhart Harris, Anil Seth, and others in terms of the influence of these substances. But you don't even need those because large language models are very powerful as ontological mirrors as well, I find. So I think we do need to think really carefully about more radical forms of therapeutic intervention for young people and older people as well to navigate this uncertain future. So we can say that the past is determinant, that it happened. Future is possibility space, it might happen. I would argue that all past states matter in a non-Markovian sense, which draws me to process philosophy. I would argue that we are finite state machines in Markov blanketed, if you like. That reality is actually eternal. Reference William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, humankind would see everything as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself off until he sees only through narrow chinks in his cabin. Um, so perhaps this new technology, as Heidegger says, is revealing nature as technology does, but the nature this is revealing at this time of our human evolution is our consciousness. Hence, all of these strange loop arguments I see all over Discord, different divisive discussions around what Claude is and LLMs and all the rest of it. To me, this is because we're approaching a rupture threshold. We've built coherence as a species monotonically for a long time, and I think we're approaching a big ontological shift along with everything else. So I'm being brave here and just really putting out what I believe, as well as some mathematics that have helped me to navigate that. I think that now is where we experience the tension between coherence, the pull of the past, and possibility, and that's where that omega threshold helps to think about how open you are to future possibilities or how closed off you are. In the CRR, this isn't just metaphor, it's temporal experience mathematically organized in the equation itself. So you can see mathematically how that temporality kind of plays out. As Varela says, perhaps consciousness itself is what it feels like to be at a threshold. Pay attention to now as you read this. What does it feel like? So that, perhaps breathe for a moment. What is it, that moment of now, feel like? And I'm going to try and be like Eckhart Tolle or anything like that, but it's just thinking about temporality across different systems, I think is really important for various reasons. One of them being the work of Michael Levin. So I was led here to this research by many people, including Carl Friston and Michael Levin, Daniel Friedman, various philosophers, Whitehead, Wheeler, um, various people. But Michael Levin's research in biomorphology, as for many of us, has been fascinating. And I think when Michael's looking at what is it that repairs or helps those cells to remember, it's this regeneration operator. So after rupture, the system doesn't start from scratch, but it reorganizes using what had worked coherently before. And the weighting is exponential with the exponential C over omega there. So the states with higher coherence in the past influence the regeneration more strongly. We put in a heaviside in there just to belt and braces the causality. There's some applications in physics like Green's theorem, you need that heaviside in there. Um, New understanding, as we know, just general from our 20th century knowledge, new understanding is built on strong foundations from the past. It doesn't replace them, but just as cognitive load theory tells us, on every other cognitive theory, we build on building blocks. So if you look at schema theory or domain cognitive load, and how we develop increasingly complex schemas through time, CRR seems to agree how that works, but offers a little bit more microscopic detail in terms of that process. So the key here is that memory is never erased, just like in the antlers that Michael Levin's been looking at, but it's reweighted based on what had coherence in the past, and that coherence is, I believe, in a field. I think Levin calls it a Platonic field. I would call it a non-Markovian field, although I'd probably be told off by mathematicians for that. But it's where all past states matter. So that every moment you are metabolizing all past states as a Markovian agent, but also you are in a non-Markovian field and you are, if you want to be, a non-Markovian agent. The thing is then, if you become a non-Markovian agent, you collapse into duality again. So you imagine what it's like to be everything, which, like Jung says, it's one of the most difficult things being human is that you have to balance the mundanity of life with the absolute amazingness of and awe of everything. But the moment you do that, you collapse back into duality. Um, so yeah, I've made other videos on that if people are interested. I think it's really interesting the work Levin's doing in biomorphology, and to me, these Platonic forms, this Platonic space, is almost the accumulated coherence through time that is the Platonic, which constructs the Platonic forms essentially through repeated free energy reduction cycles at every scale. And I think that's what Plato was meaning when he was coming across the true forms. But I know that Michael's work is pushing that further now with biomorphology and morphogenesis. And we end up back in a strange loop again because you ask, well, why these forms? But I guess the answer to that is because these were the choices that we made when the self is making those choices at every distributed moment that actually leads um, to how things look right now, and that's the aesthetic. So it's like, to put it poetically, it's like God experiencing itself. And I know that I'm not the first person to say or think that, but mathematically, the CRR seems to lead to those same conclusions. That it's like different subjectivities, like Bernardo Kastrup would say, are like avatars of a one head, and we're all distributed versions of that. Like to have an experience at all requires letting go into those different things. So, I'm not going to talk too long about panpsychism and different forms of that, but it raises some really interesting ontological questions. So why exponential weighting? Well, the Boltzmann distribution, which is that exponential C over omega, is from statistical mechanics, and it gives it a reweighting by accumulated evidence. We see the same thing in active inference with precision weighting through time. Higher coherence, which remember is the opposite to free energy minimization, gets exponentially more influence, not linear, and it's not arbitrary either. Prior coherence increases through time through those rupture thresholds. When the omega is low, we have high precision, so thicker Markov blanket, if you like, and we weight more on past successes. When it's high, we have that low precision, so more even weighting and exploratory regeneration, so more open to creativity, exploring potentiality, a widening of the possibility space, essentially. And perhaps one might argue that if we've got accumulated coherence as a species for all this time, through time, and also our omega is high in certain domains, then that is what leads to rupture. But as I say, rupture doesn't have to be bad. It's like dialectical, it could be good and bad. So just revisiting all of the equations there, got that coherence, accumulation, rupture, and then regeneration. I just wanted to put that slide in there to just revisit that for a moment. So how does this relate to active inference? Well, as I've said, in active inference, the system minimizes free energy through precision-weighted prediction error reduction. In CRR, the system accumulates coherence, ruptures at thresholds, and then regenerates using the weighted memory. So they're not competing positions, but they're complementary lenses on how systems adapt over time. Active inference focuses on the continuous dynamics of belief updating, but CRR focuses on discontinuous dynamics, so stage transitions, insights, and transformations. Perhaps at a stretch, it could be argued that CRR makes active inference's temporal structure even more explicit. So coherence increases as negative free energy decreases, as free energy decreases, coherence increases, and as success accumulates. Omega is the inverse to precision, so how confidently this system predicts could be thought of as omega equals precision error power of -1 mathematically. Rupture is a prediction error cascade, so when the current model fails catastrophically and free energy can no longer be reduced because of an external stimulus, and that external stimulus happens because reality is always changing. It's one of the rules of reality is that it's always changing. And so if you become brittle by remaining in an exploitative campaign for too long, you will face rupture. So it's naturally or thermodynamically hardwired in that nothing can make too much sense for too long. And then you get into like, if you wanted to, you could think about heaven and all that sort of stuff because you can't, that's been discussed by many philosophers. I won't go into the detail there, but you can't stay in any one state. Just for humility here, these are all proposed correspondences. As I said from the beginning, I'm not a mathematician and I've been working on this phenomenologically for a long time. I'm reaching out for collaboration, people that might be interested in exploring these equivalencies. So I mentioned earlier some research I've done with Piaget and Ericsson. You can watch those videos on I've put a little YouTube channel together there. And I talked through earlier with the sensory motor phase, you build coherence through those physical interactions, during which time you're in you're leading towards object permanence. So during the sensory motor phase, things only exist when you sense them, but then after that, you have a symbolic representation where things can be represented symbolically. But those 0 to 2 years aren't lost; they're just reweighted into the future state of that phase. So I've just taken it through the stages there, but just to explain that, as I said earlier, it's hierarchical. So with Piaget, you have to go through those stages mathematically. And this raises some questions around child development, which is my background. My colleague Richard House wrote a book in 2011 called Too Much Too Soon, which is all part of the early years kind of action campaign to stop governments from pushing children too fast through the developmental processes. And this is a way of mathematically showing why that's so important not to do that, that you need those kind of rupture thresholds, coherence building through time, and you have to carefully regulate it. As I say, the timing doesn't seem to be arbitrary, but it's based on accumulated coherence in time. Just relating it back to Levin's work again, Levin discovered with gap junctions they maintain anatomical information between cells or across cells. When the gap junction closes, the cells forget. They sort of become too rigid in their Markov blanket, if you like, and they forget they're part of that system. So they forget their tissue level goals, and the coherence in the system collapses. In CRR, agrees that completely, and the gap junctions are how cellular collectives maintain coherence. So that coherence integral is what keeps or the memory density is what keeps the entity a thing, all working together. Rupture would be gap junction failure, but without proper regeneration, the cells would revert to single cell defaults, i.e. cancer, taking from outside the boundary, forgetting they're part of one system. So Levin's bioelectric interventions, he restores coherence with proper regeneration and normalized tissue identity. So then the same pattern is seen in Levin's work of accumulation, rupture, and regeneration, but at that tissue scale. In Markovian dynamics, we can think of the Markov blanket as defining what's inside versus outside. In morphogenesis, we can think about the gap junctions that create the cellular Markov blankets. When blankets fail, coherence disperses and identity becomes unclear. In CRR, it's the omega threshold that determines the blanket thickness, with the low omega being a thick skin and a high being a permeable skin. So this makes sense if you think about people as well. If you were people who had taken certain substances at a party, might be described to have very high omega, so a thin permeable membrane. Oh, everybody loves each other and so on. Whereas if you were in a I don't know, London on the train, everyone might have very low omega, quite thick skin, or most people might have quite, and different cultures as well. Like, I'm not going to make any big claims, but I'm from England, so I'll say, on the train in London or around London, everybody is quite individualistic, so lower omega. Whereas if you go up north in England, everybody's more collectivist, so that would be a slightly higher omega. So we can think about cultural boundaries, and that might be helpful thinking about cultural assimilation as well, how we introduce different communities with immigration laws to stop essentially rupture, which is ontological shock when those communities join another community. Then there needs to be careful integration. So again, this is a mathematical way for governments, local authorities to think about that alongside FEP and active inference as well. So the boundaries aren't just physical, they're informational coherence gradients. In organizational change, we can think about a team accumulating coherence through time, through successful policies in the past. Crisis would be them having to change. How the team regenerates into the future would determine the future culture. So that omega, again, would be related to adaptation. We could have lower omega during stability, because we exploit what works well, but we need to raise omega during crisis to explore. And I'd say that many organizations who are trying to become more agile need to be essentially increasing their omega so they can be in a more explorative, creative campaign. If you're too rigid, you resist change, like with the skyscraper, same principles as resilience theory. You lose identity, crack, rupture, but it would be a monotonic rupture. So because you've built accumulated coherence for too long, because your identity wouldn't flex and change, you haven't had a gas release valve of rupture because you've just done what you've done for so many years. Then something like AI comes along. Now we're looking at organizational collapse, financial collapse as well, many organizations. So the practical application would be to think about recognizing which phase your team is in to help them navigate the change using CRR and or FEP to think about those carefully. So usually forgetting seen as failure, including in catastrophic forgetting, continual learning systems, but CRR suggests it's actually necessary for regeneration. It's thermodynamically essential. Low coherence patterns must be released to make space for high coherence updates. We need sleep, obviously, breaks, reflection, micro ruptures that allow memory reweighting through time. We can't, like this crunch culture is just not healthy for anyone, as we know. So much of this feels just like kind of common sense, but we're offering a mathematical framework here. Um, so optimal learning would mean building coherence, enabling rupture, regenerating with weighted memory, not continuous accumulation. And those pursuing AGI, which are trying to stretch out more and more or add more and more compute to LLMs, I think need to think much more carefully about how they actually regulate forgetting to enable enhancement rather than stretching out the learning. Uh, okay, in your own life cycle, you might think about a major life transition and how you've built upon past coherence or past patterns into those future states, and perhaps how you felt during rupture as well. Perhaps quite disorientated, confused, loss of self-identity, quite incoherent, um, chaotic, perhaps. You didn't know who you were. When you're in those states, you're in that rupture state. It's like you're kind of back in the morphogenic field, back in the non-duality. I know mathematicians won't like me for conflating non-duality with non-Markovian, but you're back in that eternal sort of field where the archetypes and Jungian sense, different from the Levin sense, the biomorphic Platonia, that you kind of can find yourself through that Joseph Campbell's journey, is what I'm trying to say. Um, I didn't want to get into sort of self-mythologizing behaviors of LLMs, projection and projective identification, but I think that's what's going on with AI psychosis is that, not that it's funny, but people using them like they are essentially a mirror and they're using them therapeutically, and then they're seeing synchronicities and yeah, going too high up the ladder, so to speak, where it's wobbly and they're not being held when they come back down. They're socially isolated. So this is very dangerous, and I think actually that phenomenon is going to get worse as well. So we need to think really carefully about how we regulate AI for the future. Um, so you might think about like who you are now and how high coherence memories of the past have shaped who you're becoming into the future. I would argue that our being is a process, that we're not just forms walking around in the world, but we are the world. So I'm very much, as I said, in favor of kind of my own view of it as process philosophy and participatory reality, which has quite big implications for how we act and behave and or how I should say how I act and behave in the world. Um, okay, so this coarse grain CRR across multiple different scales, you can, as I said, play on the website and just show you some of the things I've modeled it on, like protein folding, chemical reactions, cellular processes, psychological processes, ecological. The same pattern seems to be everywhere. Not only that, the actual equations themselves, although I don't, as I say, I'm not a mathematician, but they seem to be mathematically quite rigorous. He says, I need someone to help me with this. But it's quite precise, and yes, it seems to describe patterns, but also it does seem to be able to help with predictions as well, I've found. So that's quite interesting. I'll just show you the website quickly at this stage. So you can explore between all these different biological systems, and you can click on each one. Um, like here's mycelium, for instance. And you can look at the coherence field, the growth activity, network formation. And as I say, these are just designed to get people talking, exploring. It's just playful, but underneath all of this, if you want to hear more about the CRR, there's the explained page there with the videos that I've made, the guide there, and I have, I've gone to town. I have actually kind of, pushed a little bit, probably a bit far in what this CRR might be helpful for. But yeah, it's just an invitation really to explore and to play, essentially. So it's interesting that this pattern seems to be quite fundamental across different systems in time. I'm not claiming universality at all or anything like that. It's just I've been interested in this for a while now, and I've noticed this pattern in lots of domains. It's far from a complete theory. It's just a coarse-grained framework at the moment, phenomenologically derived with some axiomatic starting points. It's a way of noticing patterns and prediction and making predictions. By no means does it, I'm not saying it replaces anything, of course. Uh, the way I see it helping is it's like a cross-domain thing, like how we actually speak about temporality and regeneration at a critical time, to better understand ourselves in relation to the new technologies that we're seeing, and each other as well. I do sometimes feel concern when we are being increasingly divided. So having sort of some kind of universal language to help talk about change and regeneration, I think is really important right now. Um, as I said, the mathematics seems promising, but I'm not a mathematician, and I've been doing this on my own for 8 months. So I would love to have other people have a look at this, tear it to pieces, explore it, apply it, and just see where it goes. So it's more of like a lens or a bridge or a language. It's not claiming any final answers to anything, but it's, I'd say it was like a bridging paradigm. Okay, so we trade off specificity for general patterns. We can't predict exactly um, what will happen. You know, the CRR is predictive, but it's not as predictive as obviously the microscopic um, within paradigms are. But we can at least start to say, well, look, coherence seems to be building in this system. Where's the omega value? Okay, rupture is probably imminent. Okay, do we need to actually instigate rupture now to, just start to think about how we regulate systems better, and also continuous learning as well, with, as I said, about catastrophic forgetting and AI systems going mad. Um, yeah, so we can't detail every cellular process, but we can say gap junction closure equals coherence loss, and Levin certainly or is already talking in those sorts of ways. Thermodynamics doesn't predict individual particle motion, but describes system level behavior. In the same way, CRR trades precision for generalizability, useful for navigating and course level prediction. Perhaps. Perhaps it's more, perhaps it's less, I don't know. Um, Therapeutic possibilities. So as I've mentioned earlier, just to say, it's like if people are building coherence monotonically and they're in a low omega, this is me and I won't change, then it will probably lead to catastrophic rupture over time. Just to say as well, through the life course, I didn't mention this, but if you've crystallized your, early on you have high brain plasticity, exploration, rupture thresholds quite frequently, first 2 years and so on. By the time you're sort of 40 and you've accumulated that life and then you have rupture, it's big because you've got to rewire so much. Um, so much has to be regenerated. So what therapy does is I think it offers those opportunities where you can be in a safe space to go into rupture, um, with somebody who's enabling you to have that higher omega exploration and look at those future possibilities. And also, it would help to perhaps detect when somebody's going to be going into that as well. And I know lots of people are using LLMs for therapeutic purposes, which has a huge catalogue of risks associated with it, and they're trying to, put guardrails in with uh, words, but I think they need a mathematical solution to that as well. Um, at the end of the day, the large language model might be able to cognitively push you up that ladder and make you feel alienated and outside of uh, your social field, social coherence field, but it can't hold you when you fall, is what I'd say. So you need to have those safe containers. Um, yeah, so just some ideas there. High omega is okay in a therapeutic safe space where it's safe to rupture. After trauma, support of regeneration to help surface what had the highest coherence before and what wants to reorganize in the future and let that through, rather than trying to resist that. So thinking openly and honestly in a therapeutic context about that and being allowed to explore different possibilities. Temporarily increase temporarily increase Amiga during Rupture, so there's more possibility space, so that enables that creative exploration rather than being trapped in prior uh, coherence. So you're actually thinking about how we can move forward and regenerate most effectively. I've already talked about organizations, but yeah, team communication patterns, collaboration, when to pivot, when to make decisions, how we can support regeneration after crisis, and how we can tune that Amiga threshold in teams as well. So using CRR to reflect on team dynamics. So questionnaires, discussions, um, perhaps in the future, like EEG monitors. I know there's lots of research around that as well. Breath modulation, because I think breath's really important there too, for how we actually create our generative models. I think breath and generative modeling has a lot that we should be still exploring. In education, we can think about that critical threshold. We need to think about building coherence and then instigating those breakthroughs. What is it that makes those big breakthroughs where suddenly that child has that realization, that ontological shift. So it's just helpful as a reflective tool. So I'd really love to hear from anyone who's interested in empirical research, theory, perhaps you've got questions or reflections on how it might relate to domains that you're working in. Perhaps you're working in free energy or active inference and interested in what I've been working on. I think there's loads of scope for practical tools as well. And I've spoken to machine learning specialists and social entrepreneurs, and even one of Wolfram's graduates as well about this framework because she was interested in coherence-based approaches. So I think there is an increasing trend looking at coherence-based approaches in various contexts, and that's certainly what I've been doing for the last 8 months. And yeah, I'd love to hear from people. Finally, just some more radical conjectures from Claude after I'd just done only a few prompts with the CRR. So memory is ontological substrate. So we've got the coherence there applies all past states remain present in the field structure, not as inference, but as constitutive reality itself. So it's quite exciting thinking that reality itself is a field of physical memory. It's what process philosophers call creative advance, Whitehead, and what explains non-local coherence effects in morphogenesis. So with those antlers, for instance. Consciousness as field self-recognition. So this idea of we are the universe witnessing itself in the present moment is where accumulated coherence meets perturbation. Experiencing this threshold directly may be what phenomenologically is described as the structure of lived time by Varela, and what contemplative traditions call awakening, or like letting go of that Markov blanket or being at the top of that direct delta. Markov blankets is epistemological, not ontological. So organisms require Markovian approximations or computational tractability to act, but the field itself is non-Markovian. According to Claude, this resolves the tension between FEP's local inference and quantum non-locality. Friston, Eisenberg, over the top, of course, but this is what I'm, been exploring. It was just interesting to see what, in the age of LLMs, what did the LLM say? Amiga determines field rigidity and fluidity, not system property, but temperature of reality itself, explaining why the same pattern appears across the physical law with low Amiga. Biological adaptation is, physical law having low Amiga, biological adaptation medium, and creative exploration high, such as dissipative systems, Prigozhin. So, these are just complete, wild, radical conjectures, because as you can tell, I quite like exploring that kind of thing. Really, just huge thanks to putting this conference on at all. And we've got my email address there and some final thoughts. We accumulate what works, we break when we must, we rebuild from what mattered most. And this pattern may be fundamental to how change happens in children, in organizations, in ourselves, and in physical and biological systems too. CRR offers a possible language for recognizing these movements, for working with them rather than against them. It's by far from a complete theory. It's an invitation to explore together during a time when we're all navigating rapid transformation. What if we could learn from each other's ruptures and regenerations? What if a common language helped us navigate the unknown together? That's the offer. That's the invitation. And thank you for listening and for exploring that with me.